Hello, and welcome to another episode of Civil Rights University Podcast. I'm your host and Professor Brian K. Leonard, founder of Civil Rights University and host of the Civil Rights University Podcast. Civil Rights University Podcast is designed to help fulfill the mission of Civil Rights University, educating a generation of civil rights activists by bringing in stories of activists, attorneys, and social entrepreneurs to our audience. These examples of activism are inspiring, uplifting, and instructive for those engaged in the struggle for civil rights. In today's episode, we discuss a civil rights activist who many have mixed feelings about, Booker T. Washington. We discuss his early influences, his agenda, which focused on industrial education, trades, and service occupations, economic empowerment, and other important aspects. We also talk about what we can learn from his example and discuss how his life and his work and his activism is relevant to today's struggle. As always, we will have a link in the show notes for more resources and information about what we discussed today, and make sure that you take a look at that. So let's talk about Booker T. Washington. So for many people, I should say some people may not regard him as a quote unquote activist. In many ways, his life and his work became defined not by the word beginning with a activism, but rather by another word beginning with a, which is an accommodationist. Okay. Many historians, including some of the most prominent historians of African American descent, including critics of his time, considered him to be an accommodationist. Okay, and his accommodation is specifically of segregation, Jim Crow segregation at his time. Essentially, from the time of his speech at the exposition in Atlanta, 1895, until his transition in 1915, Booker T. Washington was widely considered one of the, if not the unofficial leader of African Americans and African Americans in this country, and as we would learn, also a leader international as he traveled to various countries. And also, as we'll see too, he becomes the which is why I said when you sort of look at his activism, you can sort of trace some roots there, okay? Because he does obviously eventually, unfortunately, they don't get a chance to meet, but he becomes the reason why Marcus Messiah Garvey ends up coming to these shores in the first place. Okay, so and obviously Marcus Messiah Garvey, certainly we would consider, an activist, one of our earlier activists, particularly under the circumstances, and so in that way, right? If he becomes the reason, because it was his correspondence with Marcus Garvey, as we'll come back to later, that helped to get Marcus Messiah Garvey on these shores. It's just unfortunately the unfortunate situation of history and time is that by the time Garvey would arrive, President Washington had already made his transition. But again, during this period, 1895 to 1915, around 20-year period, he was the unofficial leader of African American. In fact, hit one of his chief critics, which is his contemporary, but also not. There was a pretty distinct age difference between the two, and certainly in Du Bois's case, who that's what I'm referring to, Dr. W.B. Du Bois. He lived to be 95, so he outlived Washington by a good 53 years, I believe. And I believe there was about a 13-year age difference between the two. So I mean, he became, in many ways, he was his contemporary, particularly as it relates to starting the Niagara movement. And they did obviously interact many times, and their interactions became the story, right, and under the circumstances. But they did have occasion to collaborate as well. That's why I said, many folks may not consider him a quote unquote activist, but he did have certain activism pieces in his life and career. But again, as we said, even Dr. Du Bois, one who many would note as his perhaps chief critic, did regard him, even despite his criticism, as the unofficial leader of Black America during that time. So let's talk about Boogie Washington's agenda. The agenda he carried out, and one of the real, I guess, disagreements and disputes that between Boogie Washington and Dr. Du Bois, the president, of Tuskegee Institute, which of course is now Tuskegee University, versus the professor, right, and Dr. W. Du Bois, who taught at several colleges, including at some time, this is interesting, during the summer at Tuskegee. In fact, I believe it's determined that there were around 3 job offers between the two of them, and there were different reasons why it didn't happen. Du Bois accepted jobs in other places. And of course, Du Bois did teach at Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta University, for many years as well. So there are different disputes about that. And in fact, Du Bois actually attended Fisk University with one of President Washington's wives. So again, so like I said, so there are all these intersections between the two and interaction. Like I said, they actually interact. Like I said, and actually at one point when Du Bois taught during the summer at Tuskegee, they dined together and those kinds of things. So they certainly interacted with one another. But again, the crux of their dispute really looked at the agenda of either one for the best way to progress and advance Black America at that time. Of course, just remember, so let's for sort of a background, remember, this is around the end of the century, the turn of the century, transitioning from, of course, the 1800s, 1900s. And of course, as Du Bois would prophetically declare that the problem of the 20th century would be that of the color line. So, I mean, again, which obviously he was right, as we can know, looking back, and obviously it appears to still be the problem of the 21st century, but we'll come back to that. But the point here is that Du Bois and Washington's dispute really at its core dealt with the agenda for the best progressing Black America at that time. Coming out of the sort of, Reconstruction had been over for almost 20 years by this time. And of course, Jim Crow was firmly beginning to retrench itself and create these divisions, legal and otherwise, between the Black race and the white race. And so really their dispute really turns on, like I said, these different agendas. Now, of course, President Washington's agenda. So we have here this is the setup, right? The president versus the professor. Okay. And in President Washington's case, what he's laying out as his agenda in many ways is based upon or comes from his background. Okay. One of the interesting differences between the two, obviously, Washington was actually born in slavery, right? Born enslaved. Okay. And he wasn't there that long, but he was initially. And if you read his book, From Slavery, he talks about that. He talks about the things that he had to do and what he didn't like about slavery. But, and this is the key, and this sort of begins sort of this, I guess, story or the view of his sort of accommodation, because and one of the things that he was later criticized by Du Bois about was this, being an apologist for slavery, right? And being an apologist for those who enslaved him and his family and his people. And he begins to talk, and so of course he talks about how when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, leave, and how, there's this dependency on or relationship, besides that of enslaver and enslaved people, between, blacks and whites at that time. And so this sort of begins that. But nonetheless, obviously, he is, obviously he and his family are slavery, ends, Civil War happens. Out of the Civil War, he is, he's educated eventually. Well, early on, he always, so this is part of his agenda, because his agenda really focused on education. Obviously, he was probably the great educator, right? If not the greatest educator of African descent in this country. And so industrial education, service, occupation, trades, economic empowerment, some political power, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, biblical ethics and standards. And I think one of the things that his agenda you can see all throughout is his background. Growing up, he was, he's always wanted to be educated, wanted an education. He thought that was the best way to advance him and his people. And of course, eventually finds his way to Hampton Institute, and was educated, and really, in many ways, he modeled Tuskegee and based on his experience at Hampton Institute. And so, but sort of the first major piece of his agenda, of course, was industrial education, right? Focusing on areas, and his theory was to focus on areas where would, in a Jim Crow system, right? Because that's what he was operating in a Jim Crow system, that would allow African Americans to focus on occupations that they would have been allowed to focus on at that time. And allowed to experience at that time, and so which would be more of the of course agricultural, mechanical, service, trades type fields and occupations. And so he thought that again, and which again leads to some of the accommodations theories, is that if he could show that the Black race was useful and could do all of these things for society, then whites would accept, and eventually segregation would be dismantled based on that. Now, of course, history proved him wrong, but this was his theory, and certainly what he built at Tuskegee with its humble beginnings still stands to this day and is a testament to at least that part of his vision being a success. And again, as we said, the quarter of turns almost quarter of a century removed from the end of Reconstruction. Okay, and essentially, obviously, at this point, in which again, I mean, we can sort of argue about strategy, right? We can argue about strategy, but certainly, the idea was for Washington to the idea was for Washington to continue his belief in education and really to expand upon that. Okay, and so, and that's what he did. And when he traveled around the country, one of the things that he did was he attempted to, encourage African Americans in particular to, invest in education, invest in schools, invest in, like these areas, invest in building businesses, and really be self-sustaining, right? And again, this really focuses on his concept again of being able to show sort of the usefulness, right, of African Americans to whites and other society. In fact, of course, he proclaimed, famously, "Cast down your buckets where you are." Now, the and again, the idea was, that he would advocate for African Americans to be their best despite the legal limitations of slavery, which he acknowledged. And again, decided to emphasize these, various positions that we were allowed to participate in his race in the labor force during that time. In addition, and one of the other pieces, of course, is he did have, and he was able to, and really in many ways, forge relationships with many of the large businessmen that own large companies at that time, including Andrew Carnegie, right, who was one of the largest killers. All right. And so, again, trying to sort of develop this sort of, almost social contract, if you will, with, funding for Tuskegee to train African American students who could then go out and join the labor force for these businesses, right? And again, it's Du Bois would say it was probably a limited vision, but it was his vision. Okay. And again, trying to figure out what the best avenue was for activism. Now, as we see, the his so really you see the focus of this industry and economic message, and really his focus was, and so when you talk about activism, maybe you could tie in a little social entrepreneurship here, because the idea was that the economic message was being able to develop the African American community to exist separate and apart from the larger white society within the limits of segregation. And of course, this lends itself to his statement, right, for which he would, essentially, and some would argue, the reason why he was sort of anointed, if not by within the race, but certainly by the larger white race and society, as the unofficial leader of Black America, is his statement about, being remaining separate, right, and that was it, right, and Du Bois dubbed it his Atlanta Compromise, right. We would compromise, political, legal, desegregation in exchange for being able to get, as I said, funding for schools and separate schools and businesses that we could, then that African Americans could then turn around and build up their communities. And so again, this becomes the obviously the basis for much of the disagreement and accommodation. But again, that was his message. Okay. And like I said, again, to be able to build up. In fact, it's reported that he is the one that dubbed what eventually became, Tulsa and Negro Wall Street. Because again, he, visited as he did, and he lectured and toured. And when he saw it, it really was, and ultimately Tulsa, prior to its destruction, really was the embodiment, right? It was the result of what Washington saw in his vision, right? A self-sustaining community with, many businesses, many institutions able to function and to really thrive, despite segregation. Okay. Of course, Tulsa was destroyed in 1921. But obviously, as some would say, this again lends itself to the limitation of Washington's vision, right? Because again, ultimately, okay, and of course he would transition prior to this happening, but ultimately, as we know, Tulsa was eventually destroyed, okay, by white mobs and others who through violence, destroyed what had been built there, which again, as we said, may reflect some of the limitations, and may rightfully so support some of the arguments that Dr. Du Bois made against President Washington. But again, this was his, vision. This was his agenda, right? And it did work in various aspects. And of course, as we said, but it was just limited in what it could produce without those additional pieces that Dr. Du Bois would advocate for eventually. Now, of course, this would also be seen through his formation of the National Negro Business League, which he would lead. Again, as an idea to create a league and an organization of businesses and owners by African Americans, and again, this trying to build and advance this economic message. Now, one of the more subtle aspects of his agenda, and really where we talk about this activism piece, is that he did advocate, and not just advocate, but he did take certain concrete steps to advance political power for African Americans. Now, he did it in many ways subtly, deliberately, right, quietly, under the surface. Now, again, we can argue about strategy, whether that was the right thing, whether he should have come out publicly. But then there's another argument where you could say, again, he's president of a college in the South, and if he were to do that, Tuskegee could have been burned to the ground, right? I mean, let's just, or not be given the support that it was given. So again, you can argue about strategy, but he did advocate for and take concrete steps. Obviously, he did dine with presidents. He did also was very instrumental in political appointments. In fact, one of the ways that he and Dr. Bois did intersect as well is Dr. Bois's soliciting of his support, which he did give, I believe, for a political appointment for Dr. Bois, but ultimately, of course, it didn't happen. In addition, he did advocate, and this is where again, again, you talk about strategy, but he did advocate because, of course, there were many efforts for voter disenfranchisement for African Americans, one of which was embodied, of course, in things like poll taxes, in which he did advocate for the payment of those taxes and payment of other taxes. Because again, his message was to try to advocate for African Americans to do these things to sort of demonstrate, their ability and their really, worthiness of the right to vote. But of course, Du Bois and others would argue that, this right should be given to African Americans regardless, right? Because again, on the same level and at the same level it's given to whites and others, okay? And that was really the distinction. But he did advocate for that. Again, trying to keep with this idea of benefiting the whole of society. In addition, a lot of his success, I believe, and certainly success Tuskegee can be attributed to his certain biblical influence and dedication. In fact, he would require proper attire and etiquette for both students and faculty at Tuskegee. Again, trying to demonstrate these standards and show that African Americans could meet certain standards. Now, again, recognizing that certainly, the condition of enslavement that they had been subject to was not within their control. But again, going with this idea of demonstrating sort of their worthiness and demonstrating that African Americans could uphold certain standards. And I think in many ways, just to have certain individual pride and standards, as it were. In addition to try to show sort of African Americans would be respectable in every sense of the word, and again, deemed worthy to enjoy equal rights. I think one of the ways, and again, you can see sort of his activism here, is one of the ways in which President Washington, his theory, if you will, is his theory of the case. If you're making an argument, a legal argument is, if he were to demonstrate the usefulness to the trades and service occupations, which he did, and let's be clear, he did provide that in the South. The whites in society were very, it was beneficial. The service occupation things that Tuskegee students and graduates would provide were beneficial, did have an impact on the South, and certainly labor force and those things. But the idea was that if he was to demonstrate that eventually, right, the white race and society and government would relinquish segregation voluntarily. Now, of course, again, history would note that wouldn't happen, but that was his theory. But not only did he do that, Okay, and this is where, like I said, it's sort of the lesser known activism of Booker T. Washington, is he also funded legal challenges to efforts to disenfranchise African Americans. In addition, he not only did he fund legal challenges, he would also um, um, support, and through his organization and the political power that he did wield, which he did have political power and influence at that time, is he would lead successful campaigns against voter disenfranchisement. In more than one occasion. Now there would obviously be some unsuccessful challenges, but he would fund them, of course, and like I said, he would. And in fact, he and Dr. Du Bois collaborated on an unsuccessful attempt to desegregate railway, for instance. And so again, he would, engage in his own form of activism. Now, again, it would be quietly, it would be under the surface, it would be under the radar. In fact, in many cases, he would indicate for those that he was funding to do these kinds of activities to not let them know, that sort of let the public know, let it be publicly known that he was the one behind it. Okay, so he did engage in this activism, but again, under the radar and without sort of large public knowledge, particularly at that time. But he did engage in those things. And as we said at the beginning, probably his greatest gift, right? One of his greatest gifts, besides Tuskegee, to African American activism, pride, uplift, right, is his relationship with and correspondence with Marcus Messiah Garvey, who essentially was encouraged to and really influenced by President Washington to come to these shores in the first place, right? Because we know, Marcus Messiah Garvey's, Back Africa movement and those things, and a lot of that, of course, can be traced back to his acknowledgement and appreciation of Booker T. Washington's program. He really liked his program, thought it was very, very beneficial to the race. And again, like I said, would eventually, as Marcus Messiah Garvey would arrive to these shores, but unfortunately, it would just be a little too late because President Washington had already made his transition. But we know, again, Marcus Messiah Garvey was such a revolutionary figure to the African Americans in the U.S. and really around the world, right? And so again, that's another one of these areas where President Washington's activism really can be seen. Now, there's no doubt that his journey was unfinished. Agenda was unfinished when he transitioned, but of course, his legacy does live on. As I said, his shining, probably example, of course, is Tuskegee University. Okay, also other marks that he left on African American race. Certainly, current activists can learn a great deal from President Washington, including how he persevered. He progressed without the educational pedigree of Dr. Du Bois and even another contemporary and critic of him, Monroe Trotter, Harvard educated, right? And so Ivy League education. Of course, President Washington didn't have that, but he still, again, rose to national leadership. Toured the country, lectured, inspired, uplifted the race, led the race, and really developed a high standard of education and excellence, despite not having that educational pedigree. So that's one lesson, right, for activists out there, that you don't have to have that educational background to be effective as a leader and as an activist. In addition, again, you look at how he grew Tuskegee Normal School from a one-room building to today a university with thousands of students. Okay, he lectured, as we said, around the country. He formed organizations. He owned news publications and outlets to advance his messages. And to help guide his people to achieve greater levels of progress. All things that activists can learn from, right? Using media, building organizations, building coalitions. We talked about his relationships with very wealthy and powerful businessmen like Andrew Carnegie and others. We talked about him dining with presidents. Okay. And so again, that's what we mean that, if you look at, when you talk about, methods of activism, you can see many of these examples in his life, like I said. But if you just mention his name, people don't think of him as a quote unquote activist, but you can see many levels and examples of activism through his work. Also, activists can learn from his commitment and work ethic. Again, he traveled and lectured, and like you said, maybe he too much. He was so passionate about his message and uplifting his people that his schedule was very demanding, and perhaps even to the exclusion of his own personal health. More importantly, how activists can learn how to succeed in the face of opposition. Obviously, he accomplished all these things, right? So there was never, so outside of the roughly 12 years of Reconstruction, he did not experience a world or society that did not have either slavery or Jim Crow segregation outright outside of, like I said, the those years of Reconstruction. So he built all of these things. He made all these impacts in the face of probably the stiffest opposition. And so he was able to still do all these things despite slavery and Jim Crow segregation throughout his life. And so another lesson is that, again, certainly, for activists, you have certain limitations, certain legal limitations that we've talked about, sort of the retrenchment and resurgence of certain restrictions on civil rights and those things, but nothing compared to what President Washington endured, right? And so he was still able to accomplish all of these things, which were a lot, despite and in the face of that type of opposition. In addition, another important lesson activists learn is the fact that there is no one way. There's no, civil rights and the pursuit of civil rights is not a monolith. Okay. As I said, we can disagree on strategy, right? And despite the disagreements that he and Trotter and others, and certainly, like I said, most notably, Dr. Du Bois had on strategy, on the way to achieve, on the agenda to achieve the advancement of their people. The point, right, is the advancement of their people. And so he had a different way. Historians, many criticized his way or his method, but he still proved that there is more than one way, right? There's no one path. Indeed, again, like I said, heavily criticized within his own community and others, and of course outside of his community, and then even looking back by historians, but his way still did advance his people in many areas, education most notably, but others. And he did not let that opposition stop him from leading and serving his people. And he was able to do so despite his critics, which, again, another note, activists, when you get out there, you will be criticized, okay? But, again, you probably won't be criticized as much as what Washington was. And there's some argument about, history being unkind to him in that regard. And it may be true, but certainly he still pursued, and he certainly lived out what he believed, his agenda from, for as long as he could until his transition. And again, there will be many critics, even from their own ranks when you're an activist. But again, despite that, you can still move forward. And that the activists should be deterred, just as Booker T. Washington was not moved by his critics. And again, even if some of that criticism was later determined to be justified by historians. So, to sum up, again, Booker T. Washington is not considered, when you talk about sort of the historical activist model, but you can see, and we've tried to highlight some of the areas where you can see his activism still develop, both specifically in terms of fighting for desegregation, fighting against disenfranchisement, as well as in other ways that aren't traditional activist ways, which is encouraging education, industrial education, encouraging the trades, and specifically, of course, economic empowerment as a way of activism as well. And so we should all commit, all activists, civil rights activists should commit to learning about and emulating really the example set by by President Washington's example. As we can see, as his sort of chief rival, Dr. Du Bois described him after his transition as the greatest African American the South had produced since Frederick Douglass. Okay. And so again, he for obviously his chief critic to indicate that is very telling, and it shows, even despite his criticism, his admiration for the work that he did. And I think Dr. Bois even said that he questioned his motive necessarily in terms of trying to advance his people. Just it was again a disagreement on strategy, but not on the purpose, right? The purpose being to advance his people. And like I said, in that way, President Booker T. Washington was an activist. And of course, activists can learn from, may have been unlikely or unexpected activists, but certainly activists in civil rights, activists, attorneys, and social entrepreneurs especially can learn from his example. Thank you for your attention to today's episode. As always, make sure to check out any links or resources that we have for more information about what we discussed today about Booker T. Washington in the show notes. And for more information, certainly we hope you will subscribe to Civil Rights University podcast, as we'll try to endeavor to give you more content like this that will be beneficial to activists, attorneys, social entrepreneurs, or those that want to become an activist and get involved in the struggle for civil rights. As always, continue in your activism. Until next time, this is Brian Leonard, founder of Civil Rights University, and we will see you and look forward to sharing with you on our next episode. Thank you.